Thank you. Well, Annette, I have known Annette, I guess we're coming up to 8 years now. 7 or 8 years, our boys have been growing together. So my only credential for interviewing Annette is sharing a love of just fantastic ideas written beautifully in important books. And apart from that, that is all I have to offer. I have a habit of keeping friends with people who are far smarter than I am, and Annette is the epoch of that. And I think when you read her books, you get to encounter just things that are far beyond what most of us could do. So Annette is my friend, and you probably know her better than I.
I'll add something. Kathy messaged me last week, and we've had this messenger exchange over the past week of, she decided after the Sydney launch, which happened last Saturday, that I did not need any preparation as far as questions were concerned. She was going to fire away. And in response to that, she said, just sit back and relax in the chair. And so I duly sent her an image of an electric chair. And this chair is actually rather similar. So I can sit back, so if you see me explode or implode, she's good at asking questions.
Oh, no. So hopefully it doesn't go that way. Anyway, I'm assuming most of us at this stage have not written a novel yet, but we have some wonderful ideas of what a writer's life must be like. So Annette, would you give us an insight into your life as a writer, your idyllic cone of tranquility you must exist in?
My idyllic cone of tranquility is go outside and play and leave me alone for 2 hours in the afternoon so I can sit at the kitchen table and belt out a few words. That's basically life as a writer. Life as a writer is doing the ironing and getting ideas from somewhere. Usually while I'm doing the manual thing, my head's in 1938 Vienna. Life as a writer is going for long walks and reading strange books and doing odd things on the internet that make people very worried about my sanity. It's quite ordinary, really. There's nothing exceptional about it, except I suppose what goes on inside here would make some people wonder very strangely at what's happening.
Thank you. Now, many of you might be familiar with Annette's first book, A Distant Prospect. What was the kind of from initial concept to publication, about 17 years, was it?
For A Distant Prospect,
yes. And then how long for By Violence Unavenged?
6.
6, okay. So far shorter time. Can I just state the obvious, that you've actually published your second book in actually both books, in what is the most intense stage of life, because you've got 4 boys at home and you're home educating them. So if we're going to have an equation of more strain equals more productivity as a writer, can you just explain yourself? Because it doesn't make sense to a lot of us how so much busyness could produce so much work.
Let's see. Well, first of all, I think a lot of this comes down from when I was at university, and I was holding part-time jobs left, right and centre to get myself through a Bachelor of Arts degree. And that resulted in developing a mode of study which involved writing history essays on the backs of paper bags in bakeries or wherever I was working, and developing a system where you'd read on a train, you'd focus on a particular thing that you were doing, and then you would write the paragraph in odd moments here, there, while you were serving customers, this was 5 minutes, this, that, and that. And it resulted in that sort of mental discipline to do that. And the same thing goes, I'm also a pianist. And learning the piano was the same thing. I never had access to much time to practice those luxury 2-hour stretches, 3-hour, 4-hour practice sessions. My practices were snatched here 5 minutes before a class, zapping off the recess to go and play. And it would be memorising 2 bars and thrashing those 2 bars out from the piano. Memorising again, thrashing those 2. And the same thing's translated, I think, into writing. It's come from since I was a teenager, that sort of mental discipline. If you want to succeed at something, if you want to get something done, Well, you just sort of roll up your sleeves and do it and find a way, and it's been finding a way to do it. That's my business.
I'm hoping you have some, I think you've got some relics of the writing process nearby, so maybe later you can show us some of that, what the piecing together of what ends up being rather a mammoth work looks like. I would like to ask you, so I think while you were, am I correct, when you were writing A Distant Prospect, you were playing the cello a lot?
Yes.
What's your musical life been like while you've been writing By Violence Unavenged?
Well, I started learning the violin, so it was violining a lot. So it was 2 hours a day learning the violin and trying to work out how the whole thing worked. And then playing the piano. And funnily enough, with Distant Prospect, it was Beethoven. With By Violence Unavenged, it's gone to Mozart, and I've resurrected Mozart sonatas and played. And piano for me is a way of relaxing, as well as a way of settling all the grey matter. It's sort of putting things in their places. It's working the structure of the music. I find helps very much organise the thoughts, and so as well as relaxing, it sort of helps me to understand how things fit together a lot. So while I'm playing, it's thinking out that whole process. So Mozart got the Guernsey with By Violence Unavenged. I probably needed to, given the subject matter.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I'm very thankful Frances put together a playlist for the book, because certainly I'll talk about my experience of reading it soon, but my experience was all these wonderful references to musical pieces, and I didn't know all of them, and so you want to keep reading, but you also want to stop and listen and find out what was that piece of music. And so I think the second reading through I'll have the playlist playing.
Well, that was an interesting foray, because to recreate Vienna of the 1930s and to go through all the music of that period. So it was just a wonderful exploration. We'd never really been familiar with it either, Frances and myself. So it's Frances, do you know how this goes? Or asking about investigating different songs, and suddenly, things start coming up on Spotify that we're listening to.
Yes.
It was a lovely journey for me too.
Yeah, oh, that's good. So what other things didn't you know when you were starting By Violence Unavenged that you know now?
Pretty well nothing.
Oh, really?
Pretty well nothing. My history background is medieval history and Australian and American history, and to turn my attention to 20th century Europe, post-World War I, rise of Hitler, Nazi Germany, Vienna and everything like that, I knew next to nothing. But had become fascinated about it as a result of the first book and looking at the war from the other side. And it just has completely changed my view of history. And it's an ongoing process now. I just can't wait to learn more about this and investigate more. So I came from basically the 1930s, there's the Depression, lead up to World War II, outbreak of World War II, basic stuff that everybody knows, and it's just buried away.
Wow. So what were your sources for really tackling it? Because obviously you've learnt a lot along the way.
Okay, so there were some big history books, Michael Burley's Rise of the Third Reich, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I dabbled into William Shearer. Then there was Joanna Vogel's book, A Heart for Europe, which is a tiny little book about Charles von Habsburg, Charles von Österreich, the last Austrian Empire. And that was fascinating. A lot of books written at the time about the Anschluss, from a very socialist writer, G.E.R. Getty, who was a journalist in Vienna during the period. Another gentleman, Martin Fuchs, who was part of the Austrian diplomatic corps, who also wrote a book, Showdown in Vienna, which documents the Anschluss in quite a lot of detail. Kurt von Schuschnigg, who was the Chancellor at the time, he had written quite a bit. Dietrich von Hildebrand, who witnessed who left as a result of the Anschluss. He's a philosopher, very well-known philosopher. A whole host of things, but then also fiction. I got into Dostoevsky, big time Dostoevsky. So I was reading Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, and the Brothers Karamazov. Let's see, German literature, Stefan Zweig, an Austrian writer. What's his name? Erich Kästner, who wrote Angel and the Detectives. There was a whole host of bits and bobs, depending where The interest was what was involved, what I needed to know. And then there's all the internet research, and there's quite a lot of film documentary footage on the internet available. Digging up maps of the period. Francis managed to find a 1927 map of Vienna, so that was great for street names, which have all changed. Many of them have changed now and since the war. So it was maps, food, recipes, hunting, diseases, medicines, drugs.
Smoking as a
treatment as a
for
cure of
asthma.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's all sorts of funny things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just such a meticulous, detailed, thorough book, but so lively. And of course, a lot of that comes down to the point of view that you're writing from Phoebe. So let's go to Phoebe. I don't know who knows Phoebe. If you've read A Distant Prospect, you know Phoebe. Do you want to give us the authoritative synopsis and just the connection between A Distant Prospect and By Violence Unavenged? That way I don't give away parts of the plot that you don't want given away.
This is going to be very difficult. I don't give away parts of the plot that I
well,
don't
at least
want
it's
to
your
give
fault
away.
then. So.
Okay, for those of you who haven't read A Distant Prospect, Distant Prospect was set in 1928 Sydney, and it was about the relationship between four girls who formed a string quartet, one of whom was Phoebe Ray, who was probably the most, how do we put it, the most needy and the most suffering of the four in the quartet. And she was 14 at the time of the writing of that, or of the setting of that particular book. And she's put in a position where she has to play second violin, where she would much rather play first violin, a bit of a prima donna, rather precocious, but harbouring a huge childhood burden, in that her mother died, her father had a nervous breakdown, and her father also had suffered a lot from World War I. And she's in a very estranged situation. And Distant Prospect deals some about that. And I don't want to give away too much here. Anyway, by the time I finished writing Distant Prospect, I realised I had about 5 books up my sleeve, and that decided that Phoebe's story was a particularly interesting one to tell, and it was goody. So I decided to switch narrators when thinking of writing a sequel, and to switch to Phoebe telling the story and have her take the reins, as she would like to do, because she likes to be in control of things. And so Phoebe tells the story, and it's her particular journey of her mother's death, which happens to have been a murder, and how she is bent on bringing the person she believes is the killer to justice. And this brings her up into conflict with her father, who is fully aware of the criminal, the person who did it, but takes quite a different approach to it, which is he believes in forgiveness, and she won't have a bar of it. And it leads her eventually to go in search for her mother's killer, and that takes her overseas.
Thank you.
And we'll just leave it at that.
Okay, no, that's safe.
Oh, that's what that cover says also.
Yes, well, it's all up for grabs then. Yeah. So I think one of the, like as you said, the liveliness comes from the point of view in that it's from Phoebe's, and there, I can't think of, I'm not sure, people might have different opinions, of another way in which you get to know somebody so closely as you do in a first-person narrative, because there are things that Phoebe says and thinks and feels and smells and tastes that we know about as the reader that you've never told me in a conversation when you've had, or that even, you know, it just doesn't happen like that. So you actually get to very closely, we see and smell and even feel the seasons everywhere from the inner west of Sydney, the boat voyage, and we hit Turkey and then up into Vienna, and it's lush, and I feel like I've learnt more about 1938 Vienna than I'd ever have from a textbook. And you know, the polished brass button doorknobs on the buildings, and it's just gorgeous. And you want to go and eat all the food and pick up the leaves, and it's. But one of the things about that is that you also get to feel Phoebe falling in love, and you also want to throw a bucket of water on her a couple of times because you think, how can't you see what's going on? And you don't want to stop reading the book, and just in case she goes and does something stupid.
She's quite capable of doing.
And so there's this wonderful compulsion and closeness, but you're completely powerless as the reader to change what Phoebe's doing. And, you know, I know partway through the book I wanted to stop and tell Phoebe what I thought she ought to be doing, but then by the end of the book I figured if I had have given her that advice, I might have actually been very wrong. And this brings up something I found really interesting in the book, is how this gap emerges between what you want for a character and then what is good. And actually, if I got what I wanted for Phoebe in certain situations, that would not have been good for other people or even the society necessarily. And that ends up, the more intense the book gets toward the end, as we have the Austrian society and culture crumbling as World War II is, you know, on the edge, and these poor people don't know how it's going to play out, but we do, because we sit on this side of history. So there's this marvellous tension between, you know, what's coming, and some of them are cottoned on to where it might be headed, but a lot of them are just naively just hoping things are going to get better. And when there's an elderly man who happens to be Jewish, and people are leaving, and he's too unwell to leave the country, to flee the country, and his daughter would be well enough to flee. And part of me is saying, get out, you know, get out while you can, because you know what's going to happen. But you also know if she stays to look after her father, because otherwise there's no one there for him. And that pull between what you want, but also what's good. And that sort of idea just comes up in so many times with so many different political views. Is that something you built into the story, or do you think you've more uncovered the tension that's just always there?
I built it in.
Mm-hmm.
I built it in.
So you've completely been manipulating me the whole
yes,
time. Yes.
Mind you, there are probably other things that have come up that I haven't intended. And what I find particularly interesting about a book is when you write it and you've gone in with certain things in mind, and yet there have been other themes that have just generated themselves that other people have picked up and you think, oh my goodness, so it is. And that's particularly nice. There was a theme that sort of wrote its way into the book, but as far as characters are concerned, this was a very carefully structured endeavour. Every character has a point, has a part to play in this, in representing this this really complex society, and Austrian society is very, very complex. For example, the Jewish characters, that there's a range of Jewish characters to illustrate the different aspects of the Jews in Vienna in the 1930s. Some were migrants from the Ukraine, from Romania, from Bulgaria, who have been victims of pogroms, recent pogroms, and they've come in, and Austrians given them a place, and they're actually competing for jobs with the lower classes, which is causing a lot of strife within the culture. You've got other people, other Jewish families who are Orthodox Jews. They are observant, but they consider themselves Austrian, German. They speak the language. They've actually shunned anything to do with their Jewish culture, the Yiddish and so forth. But they observe the Jewish customs and feasts and fasts and so forth. You've got other Jews who have converted to Christianity for reasons of employment, to be culturally acceptable, who've left their religion behind and don't acknowledge really any Christian element either. It's just been a ticket into the society, and they're very much resented by certain Christian persons because of this using religion to gain position. And you've got others who don't really care about their religion or any religion at all. They just happen to be Jewish by birth, and a whole range of people in between. And then you've got certain attitudes regarding anti-Semitism, which are also very diverse. You've got the old, very sort of medieval concept that, you know, the Jews killed Christ, therefore they should be persecuted and, you know, wander the face of the earth till kingdom come. You've got others who are basically resentful of jobs being taken away, of livelihood being lost. You've got a resentment regarding the fact that one's own religion has been abused and there is scandal as a result of affairs or, you know, things that were just not right, and offences taken at that. So it's a very varied set of attitudes and ideas that are at work in the society, and that's just one element, the Jewish element. The political element is another. I can go on and on about this, but so each character in the book has a function. They're there to illustrate different parts of this very, very complex society. And they each have a story to tell, and that's what's really fun as a writer, to give these persons a lot of dimension and a little thread that the reader can follow as to what happens.
Yeah.
So, and then of course how the Holocaust affects that.
Yes.
Is another matter altogether.
Yes, and so kind of waiting for volume 2 and volume 3 really to see who survives. It's yeah, and I must say thank you for writing from where Phoebe's actually talking from what, 1957 or 1958.
Yeah.
You know, at least she does, and you just think, what is the meandering tale that gets her there?
That was actually an interesting decision to make, because it's critical as a writer to establish very early on what your point of view is going to be. How are you going to tell this story? Who is going to tell it? And actually, when are they going to tell it? And that we've got a first-person narrator, but are they telling it as they're going through the action, or are they telling it from some other point in time? Now, if they're telling it from outside that point, how far removed from the actual course of events are you telling it from, and why are you doing it at that particular point? Then also, if you're telling it like that, I found the big tension and the difficulty in writing was not to make it sound like a memoir. This constant looking back, and it becomes very monotonous. So there's a combination of, yes, we're in 1956, 57 telling it, but we're going back in time, and she's actually telling it as she saw it at the time, and occasionally stepping out. So it's called what I've described a telescopic narrative, where you, starting from one particular thing, you're zoning back in and you're zoning back out and zooming in, zooming out. And then the telescope is also happening in terms of, you've got the world events going to the local events, to the family events, to the individual events, to what's going on inside the individual, the subconscious, her imagination, her thoughts, her reasoning, all this, and it goes in and out, and that becomes almost like a heartbeat, and there's another reason for that. It's another one.
Yeah, no, it has a wonderful sense of immediacy to it that you wouldn't get if it were just all had that distance in time. I've decided the second time, so the first time I read A Distant Prospect, this is my hot tip. If you haven't read it yet, don't start as a bedtime read, because part 1, because it moves so fast and you've got the suspicious death and there's clues and there's... Yes. Yeah. Oh, did I say distant prospect? I'm sorry, my mistake. Don't start it as a bedtime read, because I did, and I couldn't sleep, just because you're just trying to connect the dots and make sure it all makes sense, and it does make sense. So that's one reason. The other reason is that I got upset, like genuinely just upset for Phoebe and the things that she encountered in her childhood and adolescence. And it is very artfully done that you so quickly come to care about this character. So upset and I think a bit riled up about the injustices, as we ought to be. But then, you know, it was just a handbag book, because you just got to find out how does this actually play out, and you really need to know. So my first reading of the book was just what's this story, and enjoying the story for itself. My second reading, I'm going to have the playlist going. I'm going to eat all the food and look up Google Earth and find, you know, see if I can work out where things are, and just, you know, and every little film that gets referred to, go and find it and watch it. And thank you for listing them in the back of the book. And perhaps go on and have a holiday in a hunting lodge in the Australian Alps, because there is just so much there that you kind of want to follow all those little rabbit trails as you're reading, but you're just compelled to keep reading because the story is just very fast moving, and it really matters. And I'm going to have a terrible time waiting for the second volume.
I'm going to have terrible time writing it, so.
Yeah, okay, well, you might have a worse time than I don't know. One, I've already mentioned just the wonderful just descriptions of just so many things, you know, seasons and buildings and food and sounds and people and the way some people touch or look at each other. How do you get good at writing descriptions?
Suffer.
Okay.
Description for me, I think different writers have different strengths and everything. Description for me is the hardest, most agonising, to be avoided as much as possible, and only write it when you really feel sure about it, the whole lot. Description is hard. Mm-hmm. Description also, because especially when you're writing in the first person, description has to come from the point of view of the narrator. So therefore the narrator has to have their toolbox of the way they see things, the way they look at the world, and so their vocabulary, what they've read, what they know about, what they like, what they don't like, all that sort of stuff. Their way of seeing is what's got to furnish their description. Not my way of seeing, yes, the narrator's way of seeing. And it was, there'd be times where I have gone over descriptions for weeks, trying to get the right image, trying to get the right combination of things, trying to work out what to describe and what not to describe, because what you leave out is as important. It's all got to be as relevant to the main character and also as relevant to the plot and the theme and the setting as needs be. So it's really tricky how you describe a person, how you describe a building, why you bother going into those sorts of details and things like that.
Yes.
With Phoebe, it became quite fun, is that she tends to, she likes animals, although it's not an obvious thing in the book, but I think she was the sort of kid that would have, be interested in animals and have animal friends and that sort of thing. I think that sort of carried with her into her adolescence and adulthood. And she tends to, you know, she would have been the sort of kid that would have loved the Narnia books if they'd been written at that time. So she tends to liken other characters she meets in terms of animals. So there's one little motif that's a very straightforward one. There's one character who sort of rises up like a badger on the attack, and there's another one who's like a deer or an elk or a stag that's been shot in the rump. You know, you'll see it, it's that. Yes. So the thing is also with description is being able to boil it down to a sentence. You know, you haven't got much time, especially in a book that big, to write lavish, indulgent descriptions. Those descriptions have to be so distilled into, you know, a sentence, a paragraph. It's all you've got to be able to give, you know, to ram, bang, boom, that's it. Yes. One picture.
Yes.
So being able to put things in such a way that it creates an immediate impression. And the other thing is actually, when you're describing, is not to overload the reader with too much stuff about, you know, character, describing them, for instance, from top to toe, what they wear, what they huge information dump, so the reader, and then the reader doesn't get much of a chance, if they haven't visualised it then, they don't get much of a chance in the remainder of the book to conjure that image, especially if they didn't get it the first time. But it's this drip feeding of little details, one after the other. You might have a fully written description for yourself, but you drip feed all those little bits as you go in as clear images as you possibly can, when it's relevant, in order to twig in the reader, oh yes, that's right, oh yes, so the way the character moves or the way they look, what they're wearing, can be dispersed all the way through the book to constantly build up this visual impression that you've got of the entire world that you're writing. So,
yes,
description.
Thank you for, well, you know, I'm glad they're there. It's certainly, thank you for the effort. Thank you for the sacrifice, the literary sacrifice. Okay, so would you imagine yourself writing historical fiction set in a completely different time and place down the track? Or are you so
I'm enjoying this
here
period.
now?
I'm really enjoying this particular era. And I find the 1930s and World War II has so much relevance to today's world that it's been a very interesting education for me, and I think for anyone to read. It's a world that's slipping away too. People are getting older, and people who were adults at the time of that action are no longer here, and so there is this sense of this world that's passing. And I can remember as a kid being seeing World War I vets, and of course they're not around anymore. So that sense of a world slipping away and wanting to be able to capture it is a lovely challenge at the moment, and it's a fascinating period in its own right. So that's where I am.
If you go from reading the book to then, flicking through Facebook or Instagram or any of these social medias on the interwebs, there's a great contrast between these ideas we have going around today about editing your life and curating and kind of defining yourself and making yourself who you want to be, but then if you had have just gone and bottled up those ideas and put them in the mouths of the characters we're seeing in 1938 Vienna, it would just be impossible and ludicrous. Like it just shows. And so I think one of the beauties of historical fiction is exposing some blind spots we perhaps have now, and it kind of thinks, well, if gets us to look at our own ideas and test that out, because there were people they got to make choices in this society, and we see them in a number of your characters where there's different political and social ideas, and then people are put in this terribly pressured situation where we have your changelings who will change the flag out the front depending on which week it is and where we're up to in the Anschluss, and but then you have other people who have very firmly held beliefs, but they're protected because it's their race, and so then they get to decide what will they do and what actually could they do, and then there are other people who have no options at all, who actually every asset culturally and socially they had is taken away from them. And this idea that we can just be whatever we want, and that the only thing stopping us from achieving our dreams is us, just doesn't hold true there. So when you're, one thing, Annette, you presented a whole range, you've got your communists and your aristocrats and your various people in different situations who have some sort of Jewish ancestry. You've got your Australian who's just visiting and getting caught up in this. And, people with hugely different views from what you would hold yourself. But you've written about them very sympathetically. So how do you get inside a character to the point where you can understand ideas and worldviews and priorities and perspectives so well that then you can write about it as if you would believe them yourself? Because I know for a fact you couldn't possibly believe all of those things.
Oh,
there's such a So how do you go about doing that?
Well, when I was young, I did want to be an actor. Okay, so that probably gives you an idea that this role-playing and getting into a character and thinking in that way, becoming a character, is something that I actually enjoy doing very much. And I particularly love writing because I'm not a very tall person and I'm a woman, and I don't like the roles that a lot of women play when they're on stage, and I can't play many of them anyway because I'm too short. So it's really fun being a 6'6" male aristocrat who likes hunting and plays the French horn. And it's really fun being something completely different from yourself that you can just get into. So you sort of stretch yourself in all different ways. And what was fabulous about writing this book was the opportunity to A, develop male characters, and B, be completely different. And it was, it really extended me. I've got to say, getting into those other shoes and being, and I do walk, look, I'll go for long walks, and yes, I am walking around lawn, but I am actually being somebody else walking around lawn. This is the crazy, this is the crazy part of writing, the imagination that goes 100 miles an hour. It's just the imagination. It's just, I was the kid who had imaginary friends. I've always had imaginary friends right throughout my life. I like my imaginary friends. My imaginary friends are a source of comfort. My imaginary friends are the way I solve problems. My imaginary friends are now the characters that people my books. It's a very real internal world. It's really strange, but that is what it is. You just start living another person. And what was very disturbing about this book actually was living so many different lives and then coming back to your own reality. And it was horribly confronting. It was horribly difficult to separate and to work through. Also because what the subject that you did, the times in which you were writing in 1938 Vienna, plus the different characters that you're writing, their emotions, their attitudes to things that were completely different from your own, and having to, yes, it was quite disturbing. Yeah.
Would you find you would spend like a few weeks at a time in the mind of one character, or you would just be, you know,
yes, actually, yeah,
dally here and there?
It was a funny thing. One of the characters, Hubie Schutz, who is the 6'6" aristocrat who plays the French horn and hunts. He came along very early in the piece, and I was developing him actually at the time. I've got some old school friends here of the 30 years school reunion, and I had a lovely long train trip to think about Hubie, and I was right into writing his story, and I will write down characters' backstories and appearances and all sorts of things in just note form when I'm working on a character. And so I got to know Hubie quite well early on in the piece, and I had to go to this 30-year reunion, and I was staying in a hotel at the time. I had to leave Hubie behind in the hotel room and go and associate with all of old school friends. And it was really upsetting. I really missed him, so I was really glad to get back to meeting this character again. And it's Francis puts up with an awful lot because I go off with all these men, you know, these male characters. And there's nothing in it. There's nothing.
No, it's really interesting to get an insight into. Do you find that because some characters represent certain ideas, and we're in a historical situation that played out a certain way, is it hard to keep the element of surprise, especially when you're gearing up for a trilogy? Because there are going to be some things that are inevitable, I suppose. Does it feel to you like, oh, the outcome for some characters is almost, you've just got to follow what they would have thought the logical conclusion, and you kind of know where they're... Great, well, exciting.
I haven't decided about some characters yet. So some things are very open-ended, other things are fairly...
So we could put in some votes. Potentially. Try and influence the outcome.
Well, it's like Dickens did. I mean, people were really upset at the end of Great Expectations with Pip and Estella don't get together. And there was an outcry over it, and so he had to change the ending. So there's two endings to Great Expectations. I'm not going to do two endings.
That's what you're saying now, Annette.
I'm still tossing up with some characters as to what their fate is going to be or how that's going to happen. It's very interesting the way characters do have a way of dictating the course of action. You think you've got it all bottled, and then, no, I'm sorry. There was one incident when I was writing, and I had one of the characters tell a lie and leaving the lie. and that was just
wicked.
Yep. When you don't lie yourself, and you have a character deliberately lying, and the narrator falling for it, and she knows she's fallen for it because of the point of view that you're using to tell the story.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yes. Yes.
That's fun.
Yeah. Yes. Do you, in terms of managing just the drama and the tension, the climax, when you've got, you're working on 3 novels that are one, how do you manage? Do you have to budget the excitement, or how do you structure?
Okay, you've got your big structure. Okay, you've got your classic opening, development, climax, down. Okay, and your sort of resolution. In this book, you've got a partial resolution. Of course, it's the first of a trilogy, and of course, with the whole thing, the whole 3 books, you've got opening, book, bomb. Okay. And then with each 3 books, it's only so it look like a cardiogram, root and bomb, and root and bomb, and root and bomb, right? Then within each chapter, you have to have the same sort of thing going on. That each chapter is constructed more or less, depending on the chapter's length and its purpose. But it has its own little thing that's going on here. And this book is rather complex. There are 5 parts to it. So each part has the root and bomb. So there are climaxes happening all over the bit. And so it's similar to a piece of music. You've got the same sort of structures happening there, but each phrase has its own little ebb and flow, and it's what's keeping the whole thing moving. And with a big book has to move, so it's constantly having a whole armoury of devices to do that. So it's unfinished action at the end of a chapter. Yes, a major climax in a chapter. A point of conflict that does this. A whole lot of different things. A letter that comes along. Things that happen. Once again, first-person narrative. Things happen outside the control of the narrator. That is so much fun. So she doesn't have a grip on what the other characters are doing. So they will surprise her. They will come out with things. They will confront. They will do, things like that. And that's creating all sorts of tensions all the way along.
Yes. Yes. No, thank you. And just thinking about writing in general, it's probably a different answer for each of the books. Did you start with The Distant Prospect, did you start with a context or a particular character or a range of characters, society of characters, I suppose, or ideas that you wanted to explore? How did you start with that story?
Ideas and character.
Okay.
Ideas and character. It was written very much in response to my grandmother's death, at least at first, and it was coming to terms with the reality of death. But then also there was a whole... that was the beginning of it, but then there was another element, and the whole element of hope and trust became very big themes in that book. And yes, there was a character that Lucy, but Lucy went through a number of evolutions. Quite a different Lucy when I wrote it back in 1995 to what I rewrote in 2004. There are a whole lot of reasons for that. What were we going on about? So. With By Violence Unavenged, likewise, there was a theme to do with the main thing being justice and mercy, but there are all sorts of other things happening as well. And yes, you're fitting a character into a theme, but once you start exploring this theme, you get this whole web of ideas coming out, and how you actually explore those ideas through character interaction, action, setting, plot, and so forth, becomes, that's where the creative work happens, and that's when all sorts of unexpected things occur. I mean, I initially thought, bomb, 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 sort of nice, easy progression. As I explored the whole thing, and as I got more involved in Phoebe's character in particular, things became far more complex. The whole nature of justice became far more complex. The whole nature of how does one learn to forgive became a very, very emotionally complex journey. And anyway, that has been I don't know the answer to that.
No, I think you should. That's fine. That's fine.
Do you want to open to other
Yes,
questions?
yes. Well, I was going to just ask you one final question before I invite people to converse. And whilst people read books and they take what they need to from good books as they read them, I don't believe in the death of the author. Your book and your ideas will outlive you one way or another. What would you hope are the ideas that would go forward into the future from this book, from By Violence Unavenged?
I think a certain wisdom regarding society and how easy it is to be duped, to be sucked into something that is it can be quite hideous, that is a big thing. And another thing is, oh goodness, is the element of that justice is a very complex thing, and how to consider that, that there needs to be a respect for the two parties, the person who is suffering, the person who has caused that suffering. How that is actually resolved is something I'm still trying to work out. That's been very interesting working out through the course of 3 books. I think the biggest one with By Violence Unavenged is the degree to which we must be socially responsible for our culture, for the things that go on. Because I put off writing about the Auschwitz because I just couldn't bear it, and when I just needed to get my head around it, my heart around it. But how quickly that happened. But it was the result of a very long-term act of political violence, of bullying, of investigation, of upheaval on the part of Hitler and his crowd, from the late 1920s through to the late 1930s, and it was systematic and very driven. And it had its goal, and it achieved it, and how easy that is to happen. It's like the chickens in Chicken Run, they're organised. And that sort of thing is quite confronting, and we can be so comfortable about our society, about the way we live, about the things we take for granted, without realising that we have to contribute to it, we have to do something about it. And that was a huge message in something that really came forward in By Violence Unavenged.
Thank you, Annette.